We're reading today from Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 22, and that is on page 199 of the Church Bibles. So that's Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 22. If someone guilty of a capital offence is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you, or if you do not know who owns it, take it home with you and keep it until they come looking for it. Then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. Do not ignore it. If you see your fellow Israelites' donkey or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help the owner to get it to its feet. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but do be sure to let the mother go, so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof, so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from your roof. Do not plant two kinds of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Do not plough with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. Make tassels on the four corners of the cloak you wear. If a man takes a wife and after sleeping with her dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her I did not find proof of her virginity, then the young woman's father and mother shall bring to the town elders at the gate proof that she was a virgin. Her father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin. But here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. If, however, the charge is true, and no proof of the young woman's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of her town shall stone her to death. She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. For the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. A man is not to marry his father's wife. He must not dishonor his father's bed.
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to King's Church. My name is Toby. If you haven't met me before, that is who I am. If this is your first morning here, you are especially welcome. We've been looking at the book of Deuteronomy, which is a very, very old book. If you've just arrived here for the first day and this is one of the first Bible readings you've ever heard, it's a heavy one, and we're going to think about today what it meant back then, what it means back now, and what the implications are for us today. Let's pray before we start. Father God, open up our eyes, open up our ears, give us hearts that are receptive to you. Help us as we study your word today to understand what it means for us. Amen. I'd like you to start by thinking about two people in your life who you love. Hold those two people for a moment. Do they know that you love them? How do they know? How about you? Is there someone in your life who you know loves you? How do you know? As humans, we communicate our love for people in different ways. You might have heard of the love languages. This is the idea that we express love in a way that is natural for us, and we receive love in a way that is natural for us. And this is frustrating at times, but sometimes the way that we communicate love doesn't come across to the other person, and this can be very frustrating. Before Claire and I got married, there's my wife Claire over there, we did something called a marriage preparation course. And on this course, we learned about the love languages, and we learned about how we might communicate love to one another. I learned on this course that the best way for me to communicate love to Claire is, wait for it, cleaning. That's right, cleaning. Which was very annoying because naturally, not a tidy guy, not a very clean guy, if I'm honest. But I've had to learn to be clean, and clean up after myself to show my love for her. Now, some ladies, they like jewelry, flowers, chocolate, and don't get me wrong, she likes those things. But, if I unload the dishwasher well, boom, I'm telling you, that is a real message of love that I'm sending to her. In this part of Deuteronomy, Moses is talking to the Israelites, and we've looked at this in different ways, but at this point in particular, before they go into the promised land, he's talking about God's love language. He's saying, Israelites, we all love God, don't we? They're like, yeah. He said, well, I'm going to show you how we best communicate that love to him. And the best way that we can do that is by loving his people. We demonstrate our love for God by loving the people of God. Now, as you know from the passage, there's lots of bits we're going to look at today. So if anything gets lost in the message, this is the key take-home from the message today. That the main way God's people show their love for God is by loving his people. And we do this, firstly, by caring for one another according to God's created boundaries. And secondly, we do that by honoring marriage and sex. So look with me in the passage to chapter 21 from verse 22. If someone is guilty of a capital offence and they're put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it the same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. Now, if you were here a few weeks ago, Pete was talking about some of the laws in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, that came with the death penalty attached, that the death penalty is prescribed for certain things. Now, in this example, someone has been executed for doing something horrific, and what the community have done is they've left the body out publicly to deter others in the community from doing the same thing. Now, this seems probably barbaric to us, thousands of years later. But this was actually done in a loving way to say to everyone else in the community, this person is cursed by God. They've broken God's covenant. They've been executed. And we lovingly want to warn you not to do what this person did. It comes with a rule, it comes with a caveat, which is that there is a line. So when it gets to sunset, the body does need to be buried. And this is done as an act of love and care to the deceased person, but also to their family. Now, we're obviously going to start with a bit of a a rare example. When we move into chapter 22, we see some more everyday examples of this, examples of when God's community are living for the good of one another. And so from verse 1 in chapter 22, we see this example of when you look out your window and you see some of your neighbours' animals, and they're wandering off, you need to not ignore that. You need to go and help. I like the repetition of don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. If you see an issue with someone else in the community, don't ignore it. Go and help them out. This kind of runs counter a little bit to sometimes the attitude of our society today. Often we have the society attitude of finders keepers. Oh, wicked, I found this. I don't know whose it is, but I'm going to keep it. Or, that's not my problem. I was guilty of this during the strong winds. Claire looked out the window and said, look, someone's wheelie bin is flying around the street. And I was just enjoying watching it, I'm afraid to say. I should have gone out and I should have moved it. But, I was like, well, it's not my problem, which is going to confess that to you today. But God's people are called not to ignore it when they see a problem. So they're to react if there's a problem. If we jump ahead to verse 8, we get it's not a reactive, it's plan in advance to live for the good of others. So when you build a house, make sure you put a parapet, put a wall around the roof of your house. You're going to be dining up there. You're going to be inviting people around for dinner, and you're going to be spending time socializing on the roof. So just make sure it's safe when people come round. Because if someone falls from the roof, they're going to die. And that's not very loving. So firstly, react and love people, but also, be prepared and love people by how you structure things. And from this verse, we also see something else, that God is the creator of the universe, and he's ordered it a certain way, and there are certain rules and boundaries and things that we need to follow. Last time I preached here was a year ago, and my analogy involved a frying pan, and I'm going to use a frying pan again from a different analogy. This is my non-stick frying pan. Now, this frying pan came with instructions with it, and it said this is a non-stick frying pan. So what's the one thing, I'm going to ask you guys, what's the one thing you don't do with a non-stick frying pan? Yes, very good. You'd never, ever put one of these bad boys in it. And if I came downstairs and Joshua was cooking some eggs and was scratching this up with that, I would be horrified. Because the maker of the frying pan says, don't put metal implements in that. Why not? Because you'll cook up some spaghetti carbonara, serve it onto the plates. People will be like, oh, wicked, some black pepper. It's not black pepper. That is polytetrafluoroethylene. That's right. You're giving everyone Teflon poisoning. And so we have to follow the Creator's rules. Otherwise, we damage what he has made. We harm other people. Things go wrong. In the same way, God's ordered this world. He's the creator of all, and he's given us rules to follow so that when we live in his world and we love each other in community, it goes well for everyone. So we see a rule here with the falling to the death, that there is life and there is death. There is gravity. You can't break the rule of gravity. God's ordered it. If you fall from a height, you will die. As we read through the passage, we see different examples of these boundaries that God has put in place. So, for example, in verse 5, a woman must not wear women's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord God detests anyone who does this. The Israelites are commanded that men should dress as men and women should dress as women, that we shouldn't blend those boundaries of gender. The Israelites are to respect gender difference, and that's caring. If we look at verse 6, we'll see one of the strangest rules I've ever read in the Bible, but there it is, it's in there. When you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree on the ground and the mother sitting on the young, don't take the mother with the young, take the young, but be sure to let the mother go. It will go well with you and you'll have a long life. I'm not going to lie to you, while preparing for this passage, I read a lot about this one particular rule, just because I thought it was quite fascinating. Now, rather than go into all the ramifications and possible interpretations, the one thing we can take from this is that nature is not an unlimited resource that we can exploit. And so God's saying to his people, take the eggs, let the mum go, then she can lay more eggs. Let's respect nature and not take unendingly from it. Let's honor these created boundaries. As we move on, we see some more boundaries and lines and differences. So from verse 9, don't plant two kinds of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Don't plough with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Don't wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. There's some things you shouldn't mix. Keep your seeds apart. Keep your animals apart. Keep your clothes fibers apart. There's some practical concepts here we can see. If you've got a big strong ox and a donkey, the plough would go all over the place. Or the stronger ox would drag the donkey along, which would be cruel. Clothes of two fibers might look great, but when you wash them, they're going to tear apart. But another thing here we see is a different division, is that priests did wear clothes that were made of two fabrics. And so we see another division between the priests and the rest of the community. In verse 12, we see this rule, a reminder from originally given in Numbers of another rule that Jews are to wear tassels on the four edges of their clothing. You might know that the Jews call these the zitzit, and they're physical and visual reminders of God's laws, so that while they're going through the day, they can remember to be obedient to them. Now, the key question, what does this mean for us today? What do these rules mean for us today? We believe in Jesus, we love Jesus, and we know that when Jesus died, he began a new covenant in his blood. Now, we're saved. We live under the rule of the Spirit. We have God's favor in multitudes. And we've got God's Spirit to help us love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus shows us how to do this. If we look to John 13, we read, "A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. Then everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." God's church, Christians, we're called to love one another, to care for one another. Just like the church in Acts 2, who shared what they had for the good of the community. Now, I'm looking at Billy here. Billy's wearing a gilet. It's got two different types of fibre in there. I think that's some wool. I can see some linen. Are we going to stone Billy to death for that? No, was the answer. We're not going to stone Billy to death for that. I've heard the Teagues have been planting different seeds in their garden next to each other. Would we excommunicate the Teagues for that? Again, no, we would not. But we recognize that God is the creator of the world, and he's purposefully ordered things in his world, his way, for his glory. So we take seriously the warnings in the Bible about mixing righteousness with evil. God's people, we're called to be holy, separate, and set apart, and we're called to be different. The church is meant to be the bastion of God's truth, not a polluted mix of false teachings. Paul warns us in 2 Corinthians 6:14, don't be yoked with unbelievers. We've seen this image of an ox and a donkey yoked together and it not going well. He says, don't be yoked with unbelievers. What does righteousness and wickedness have in common? What fellowship can light have with darkness? There is good and there is evil. There is righteousness and there is wickedness. There is light and there is dark. And when you bring righteousness and wickedness in together in a community, things tear apart. So God says, don't yoke yourself to an unbeliever. It's going to be hard. It's going to be dangerous. It's going beyond God's boundaries of care, and things will not end well. And likewise, we can't call good things evil and evil things good. We can't deny truth to accept popular falsehoods, which is very difficult. It's very difficult, especially when it comes to issues of gender blurring and gender dysphoria, and when it comes to gender roles in the church. But if we want to care for each other and live for the good of one another, we need to work hard to understand what God's created boundaries are and lovingly live within them. Which brings us nicely to the second major element in today's reading, where we see that we love the community of the Lord by honoring sex and marriage. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman, and it didn't come about by chance. And it wasn't devised by human minds. Marriage is God's invention. And it's something that as God's people, God's community, we want to honor. We know from when we studied Ephesians 5 last year that marriage is given to us to help us understand Christ's covenant fellowship with the church. It's a covenant of faithfulness. When it comes to marriage, sex is such an important part of it. It's an integral part of it. it's given to us. Sex is such a precious and special thing. And I think Helen and I were talking about the reading before we started. Some of that reading grates. It's not an easy reading to read. It's not an easy reading to hear. It's not an easy reading to preach on. It's tough. And when we think about sex is such a precious and holy thing given to us by God, and it is so, so important to him. I was working out what a good analogy would be to talk about sex, and analogies and illustrations are very, very difficult. And I was looking around my kitchen this morning for some inspiration, and I saw a tube of super glue, and I thought, bit like sex, super glue, in that God uses it to help us create a strong bond of faithfulness together. And I've got this little bottle of olive oil that comes from proper Jerusalem olive oil. And occasionally I might dip a bit of bread in and enjoy that. If I came downstairs and Claire was like frying some eggs with that olive oil, I'd be like, nah, that's not what the olive oil is for. It's precious and special. Don't use it for that. And then I saw one of the greatest cleaning. I've been getting into my cleaning since being married. One of the greatest cleaning products of all time is Oven Pride, which everyone knows is UK's #1 oven cleaner. Now, Oven Pride is an amazing oven cleaner. You put it inside the oven, cleans real easy. You leave it for a bit, stuff starts to fall off, wipe it down. You're like, oh my goodness, that's like a new oven. But if you put this on the front of your oven, on the stainless steel bit, oh man, I'll tell you what, it rips off all the stainless steel, stains it for life, starts to degrade, corrodes it away, really, really bad. The reason I think that's a bit like sex, and again, I'm concerned at using that, is that sex is for marriage, and it's amazing. It's God's gift for us to go, you guys are together and committed and faithful. I'm going to stop using my hands. And I'm giving you this gift to make you super close and bond you together, you know. But if you take that outside of marriage, people are going to get hurt, and you're going to use it for the wrong thing, and it's going to pull people apart, not bring people together. Now, we read in Deuteronomy a series of hypothetical situations regarding marriage, sex, and adultery. Now, in the first one, a man marries a woman, and then after having sex with her, to use the language of the text, he dislikes her, and he slanders her. He claims that that after he'd married her and slept with her, that she was not a virgin, which is a horrific thing to do, especially in that culture where the punishment for adultery is death. Now, to clear the woman's name and save her from this punishment, the parents present the cloth from the marriage bed to the elders. This would have been a bed sheet or an undergarment, and then the wrongdoing is clearly laid out at the husband's feet, and he gets punished, he gets flogged for that. He then has to pay twice the bridal price to the father, and he's refused a divorce. That might seem he gets off a bit lightly here, and if he had committed adultery, there would have been the death penalty. But the crime that the man has committed in this example isn't unfaithfulness and infidelity, it's defamation of character. Sex is not supposed to happen outside a marriage. It's interesting that the elders are called in to deal with this case. And the reason for that is because marriage isn't an isolated thing. Marriage is part of the whole community. I teach Judaism to GCSE, and I find it very interesting, some of the Jewish customs that come from the book of Deuteronomy. But one thing the Jews they get married under what's called a chuppah. And a chuppah is a canopy with 4 corners, and they get married underneath it because it visualizes the fact that their marriage is open to the whole community, and they should invite the community and expect that to be part of it. And in the same way here, it's a communal thing. It's not just an isolated marriage, or that's their business. It affects the whole community. Apologies. When we read verses 22 to 21, we see that if the husband was found to be correct, the woman would be stoned in front of the father's door. And the community, again, has to come to terms with the unfaithfulness that has occurred. And unfaithfulness in a covenant leads to death. In verses 22 to 27, there's a case put forward about an act of adultery, and the punishment is death for both who are involved. We then see some different cases. There's a second case about a man sleeping with a betrothed woman. Betrothal is different to the Western idea of engagement. If you're betrothed in Jewish culture, it can only be broken by divorce or death. is deeper than just a Western idea of engagement. Now, in this situation, both are to die. There's a concept there. It talks about the woman not screaming for help, which implies consensual activity. But if this same event was to happen in a field or far away from ears, the woman's given the benefit of the doubt whether her cry wouldn't have been heard, and then she'd be considered innocent, and only the man would be put to death. We then get a final case in verse 28, where a man meets a virgin who is not pledged to be married. He rapes her. They're found in the act, and in this case, the man, he has to pay the bride price for her and marry her, never allowed to divorce. Finishes in verse 30 where with this teaching that a man is not to marry his father's wife. That's not necessarily his mother. In that culture, sometimes men had multiple wives. Some people are divorced. Sometimes you've been widowed and a different wife would be taken. We see this with Reuben towards the end of Genesis and Absalom as he tries to take David's place as king later in the Old Testament. So that's what it says back then, but again, what can we see here? What principles can we see here? Well, ultimately, marriage requires complete faithfulness and self-giving love. You can't do marriage selfishly. You don't marry someone and then you decide you don't like them after sleeping with them and then try and get out of it. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, and sex is the highest way of expressing that lifelong commitment in a marriage. Sex doesn't work outside of a marriage. God's designed it and he's given it and said this is how you use it, like the frying pan, like the oven. This is what it's for. Don't take it out of how it's supposed to be used. Sex should always be done with the intention of strengthening the bonds and faithfulness of a marriage. I think that's why in the two cases put back to back, where the woman is unmarried, she and him are brought into a marriage rather than him being stoned to death, because however terribly it's occurred, a body union has been created. So what do we make of this in 2022? Well, sex and marriage have not changed. They haven't changed for God. They haven't changed for God's people. There's been strong movements to try and change society's understanding of sex, obviously very strongly in the 1960s, but even before then. And many people in society now do just see sex as a physical act. There's been movements in our country, in the Western world, in the last 15, 20 years strongly to change the definition of marriage. But God is unchanging, and marriage is unchanging, and sex is unchanging. When I had sex education at school, I was in year 8. I remember it vividly. We were in assembly. It was a special assembly. And a van pulled up outside with a picture of a condom on the side with 2 thumbs up. And it said, "Don't be silly, cover that willy." True story. The sex education I got in year 8 was have sex when you want, who you want to have it with. Just make sure you use a condom and you get consent. And that was a sex education I got at 12 years old. And in schools today, I know Simon brought this up last year, we haven't had to have mandatory sex education in schools for 7 years. It's coming back this year, but the message will be very similar, and the message our young people will be getting. So it is so, so important that we talk to our children about what sex is. That message is not keeping in what God's design is for sex and marriage. God's rules for sex and marriage is a bit like a spirit level. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience before. You put up a shelf and you put a spirit level on it and you're like, boom, baby, I can't believe I got it. I'm not very successful with this. So when it goes right, I'm like, yes, I got it level. And then you step back and you're like, that's not level. And you check it again, but it's level. And then you step back and you're like, but that's not level. Sometimes the house is wonky. That's right. Sometimes the background is out. Now, this is a bit like God's teaching. God's teaching is always right, but sometimes the house is wonky. Sometimes what God says seems to be so out of sync with what everyone else is saying that we might start to doubt it. But actually, never doubt it. Never doubt the word of God. It is always right. It is always true. Marriage is the one flesh union between a man and a woman. This is what marriage is because this is how God created it. And he created it to teach us about his love for us. Christ is the groom. The church is his bride. The two are one body forever. Christ will always be faithful to his church and will always be faithful to him. Adultery or unfaithfulness is destructive to marriage. It breaks it, and it can be very hard to put it back together again. Only by God's grace can wounds be healed. Jesus spoke about adultery in Matthew 5, verse 27-28. He says, "You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks lustfully only looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus' standards for faithfulness is very, very high. So in the age of Instagram and Tinder and in the media where sex is used to sell every single product, from things like oven pride right through to clothes, it can be very, very difficult to keep our eyes and our hearts faithful. But the people of God, we're called to hold marriage in the utmost honor. Unmarried men and women are to treat each other with absolute purity. Sex is reserved as an expression of the one body union of marriage. We are not to indulge in fantasy, lustful looks, or pornography. We've got to care for each other within the created boundaries for sex and marriage that God has created. And as we come to end this, as we're thinking about this today, our last thought, I want to guide you back to chapter 21, verse 22. Because there was a man who was hung on a pole under the curse of God, not for his sin, but for ours. Jesus. Jesus became cursed so that we might enjoy blessing. And we see in Galatians 3, verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. Jesus died. He died for us. He was hung on a tree because of our sin, our unfaithfulness to God's covenant. He hung there and died, and then he rose again, so that all who believe in him will not come under God's curse, but will instead enjoy his blessing. He became a curse for us so that the righteous requirement of law would be fully met in us who live by the Spirit. So no matter how much we've got wrong, how little we've cared for one another, we can repent, we can be forgiven, and with his people strive to love him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, as forgiven and saved people, let us care for one another. Let us live within the creation boundaries that God has established, and let us honor sex with its place in lifelong committed marriage between one man and one woman.